to try and just burn through all the content as quickly as you can. This is usually manifested when you're trying to cram for a test right before the test. Spaced repetition, on the other hand, requires that you do take some breaks in between the content that you're learning. If while you're taking this course there are times where you find yourself tuning out or forgetting what was just said, that's a good sign that it's time to press pause, step away from the computer, maybe get outside for a little while, do something different before you come back to it. On my side, the curriculum has been designed so that you do have to repeat some of the topics that we haven't touched on in a little while. There's a number of times throughout this course where I present a challenge to you, and that challenge does call back on some of the previous. In this first section, we are going to be learning everything we need to know in order to build static pages in React. And I know what you're probably thinking, but Bob, I already know how to make static pages. I understand that building purely static pages is not the reason that you're hoping to learn React, but I have found over my many years of teaching people React that it's important to first learn how to think in React. Writing good React code requires a bit of a paradigm shift from how you might be used to building web applications in the vanilla technologies of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so in my experience, it's important to first get a solid foundation of how to think about React and think in React before we jump straight into the more fun and productive parts of React that really make it a magnificent framework for user interactions and web apps in general. In order to give some structure to the curriculum and in true Scrimba fashion, we are going to be building a project throughout this section called React Facts. And although it may look like a simple static page, it's really going to help us get the solid foundation that we need in React to continue on to maybe some of the more exciting projects that we have in this course. Throughout this section, we are going to be learning why you should even care about React. Chances are you found this course because you were told that learning React is an important step if you're hoping to get a job as a web developer or level up your skills in the web development arena. And so I think it's crucial to understand why people are telling you to learn React. Naturally, we'll be learning how to set up a new React project, and this bullet point actually encompasses both creating a new React project in the code, which you'll be doing directly here in Scrimba, or for those of you that happen to not be following along in Scrimba, we will be covering how to set up a new project on your local machine, which of course will be helpful for anybody when it comes time to building your own projects outside of the Scrimba environment. Then we'll be learning about the fundamental pieces of React, which are React elements. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how you set React up locally on your machine, I want you to get your hands on React as soon as possible. If you're taking this course on Scrimba, then you'll be able to just click into the same editor that I'm using and type along, do the challenges, and so forth. Assuming you have some experience writing HTML and CSS and some associated JavaScript, you should be very familiar with the idea that if you want something to show up on the browser, this is our mini browser over here, then we need to include it as markup in our HTML file. So I would just add something like an h1 that says hello world. I hit save, and sure enough, hello world shows up in our markup. With React, we take a bit of a different approach. Instead of adding anything manually to our markup, React will be in charge of taking our JavaScript and adding the associated markup to our HTML document for us. In order for this to work, I need some kind of placeholder. We're going to add a div here, which gives a place to React where it can insert all of the markup that we generate using React in our JavaScript files. I'm going to give this div an ID of root, and we'll see why in just a second. And before we move over to our index file, you might have noticed that the file extension here is .jsx. We're going to cover why that is in just a minute, but for now, let's just treat this like a regular JavaScript file. Here in the Scrimba interface, the implementation of React is sort of hidden behind the scenes. You can see in my dependencies, I'm using React version 19. Actually, at the time of recording this, the release candidate is all that's available right now. React 19 is on the cusp of being officially released. But because I have these dependencies installed and Scrimba is taking care of all of the bundling details and everything behind the scenes, if you have no idea what that means, that's okay. We're going to talk about it in just a few scrims. Now, before we move on, let me hit save. We'll get rid of this hello world that was showing up there because we removed that from our markup. And now to get the very most basic React app set up, I need to do two things. The first thing is I need to create a root. And don't worry about the terminology, we are going to be talking about this in just a second. And the second thing is I need to render some markup to the root. In order to create a route, I'm going to import, believe it or not, a method called createRoute. And this is going to come from the React DOM library, but from a specific submodule called client. So I need to import createRoute from React DOM/client. We can use this method to create a route. We'll go ahead and call it a variable route, and we'll call createRoute. And here we are. Why is it called a route? Well, since in React we are going to be rendering all of our markup using React inside of JavaScript files, we need one central location where React can insert all of that content. And as we mentioned, this div with the ID of route that we set up is going to be like the root of our application. It's the one place where React will insert everything. So what I need to pass to the createRoute method is this DOM node, and I can get it by doing any regular DOM node selection. I can say document.getElementById, for example, and pass in the ID of route. And now that I have a so-called route, I can call a method on that route called render. Again, I know we're moving quickly. I'm just doing this so that we can get your hands on the keyboard, and then we'll come back and practice this and revisit it, so don't be too concerned about that. Okay, so what do I pass to the render method? Well, this
right now. You are H1 and H2, and also the paragraph tag. Next, you learned about nesting, which is how we place certain tags inside of other tags, which again are inside of other tags, creating this tree-like HTML structure. And you learned about buttons and input fields, which are two tags that help us make our website interactive so that users can perform actions on our website. We also learned about the important anchors that make our website interactive so that users can perform actions on our website. We also learned about the important anchor tag, as that is what allows you to create links in between different websites or internally on a website in between pages. Another thing which we had to look at was the document structure, because a proper HTML document requires a doc type, an HTML tag, a head tag, and a body tag. And then, of course, you learned about lists, both the unordered list you can see here and also ordered lists. And then at the end, we did something super cool, which was to deploy our website using Netlify so that it lives out on the World Wide Web. So at this point, you might be a little bit overback. You are going to our websites look good. So that is going to be Welcome to the second section of this course, where you are going to graduate from HTML into the world of CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, as it stands for. This is super exciting because now you'll be able to make your sites look beautiful as well. So the main project of this section is actually the google.com homepage, because this time around you are going to write the CSS as well. And this probably looks a little bit frightening right now, but don't worry, I'm going to take you through it step by step. And actually, before we get going with Google, we're going to get you familiar with the syntax here and have some fun destroying wikipedia.org. So it's going to be a lot of fun and we have no time to lose. Let's just get started. Okay, so let's get you writing your first lines of CSS straight out of the gate. As you can see here, we have an HTML file which has a body that simply has "please accept our cookies" as text directly in the body tag. And that is rendered here in the mini browser. However, as you'll notice, the style doesn't exactly look like default browser styling. And that is because we've added this line here, which says link, meaning it's linking to something. And what kind of relation does this link has to our HTML? Well, it's rel style sheet. It is a sheet that contains styles. And where does this sheet live? Well, that is dictated by the href attribute, which you probably recognize from anchor tags, and it's pointing to styles.css. And lo and behold, in our file system, we have a styles.css file. And there we can see a few lines of scary looking code you've never seen before, perhaps. However, don't worry, we're going to go through this. So what happens here is that this CSS code is being pulled into the HTML file by this line 3 here, and then it is applied to the website when it is rendered. So if we were to comment out this line 3 here and rerun the example, it'll look very boring like this. So let's undo that. Doesn't exactly look great now either, but it's at least some styling. Although this cookie widget is a little bit weirdly designed in my opinion. Which leads me to your challenge. You are going to redesign this cookie widget by changing the values inside of this body selector. And now you might ask, well, what is a selector? Okay, let's go through that, because that is the basic CSS syntax you need to know in order to solve this challenge. So, CSS works by selecting certain elements on the page, that is HTML elements, and then styling them however you want. And the element you select is what you start with when writing a CSS rule. Here, we are selecting the body. That is the exact same thing we're doing here. And what's our body? Well, it is this tag right here. Then, in order to apply some specific styling to the body tag, we write an opening curly bracket and a close curly bracket. And then inside of those brackets, we have something called a property, which in this case is color, and a value, which in this case is red. So here we're saying that the color, which is actually text color, that's what color means here, the text color in the body should be red. So if I now change the color property from blue to red, you can see in the mini browser we have changed the text inside of our body to red. Because if we head over to the HTML, this text is indeed inside of our body.
قيس
ما تخش.
سايكو اخويا
شو كدير؟
انا نديرو
هاي
جلوري.
الكليريا هذه
اوكي عندي بروبليم، الكلافي تاعي ما يكتبليش الاخرى على بالك.
شني
ما عنديش ذيك اللي انت كدير الت كات.
اكبر واصغر.
انت كدير الت 5
ها
تخرج لك هذيك الاخرى اللي تفتح بها الفانكشن.
اصبر. الت 5 الت كات ماشي 5.
ما انا ما تمشيليش الت كات، مشيت كلافي جديد واحد.
باقي
الت اللي على الدروات هذيك شيدها من الاخرى. كاين زوج
الت جي
يبدل. ماشي الجير الت دروات هي اللي الاخرى. هي اللي دير.
ما عنديش الت ضربات، هذا هو المشكل.
بالله لقيتو مش مكلي.
لازم لنا كاركتر جدد.
هذاك نبدلو اسمه نجيبو بوكلا ونجيب. كيف قلت لي لا ما تمشيش السبيه.
مشيت كلافي في
انا ما عنديش اصغر واكبر هذوك كلافي، اسما لازم كي ندير نقلبها ونقلب نديرهم.
كلافي دوكا نقيس ربو دوكا.
شنو تبدا الرياكت؟ تقدر رياكت هايل. رياكت نشتيه انا هايل.
رياكت جي اس وحاب مش كيف لا
الرياكت هو شتي جافا سكريبت مخلط باش تي ام ال.
خليك يكمل سي اس اس. كملت اش تي ام ال كنت دخلت سي اس اس نكمل سي اس اس ونروح الرياكت.
قيس بك سي اس اس ما تكملش كلش. قيس بك كيفاه دير سي اس اس هذا ما كان تسحق. كيفاه تبليمونتي سي اس اس هذا ما كان. كي تحب باغ اكزومبل تحب تكبر تصغر تمنيكا كيما هذاك هذا هو سي اس اس. حبيتي بالله.
اصبر لودي.
ما تكثرش الوقت مره في سي اس اس تضيع وقت مضيعه وقت. عندك فرحتك. في تويلايت الفيديو راجع كليبوك لا راجع كليبوك لا 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 لا
ماكش مكونيكتي.
هيك فيه مش بوكلا كامل مش مكونيكتي. انا حيدك كينج بوست مش قال لك 4 تريد انا ايش بيك السبي لا تشكون بالفريقه ولا زبي. كل 4 تريد تبون عطاي تبون يدير كي يدير كي. اسمع شوف كينج بوست اسمع شوف ايكو بي اس اف هو ليفت هذا في 3 ب $11 4 تريدرز اكسكلوسيف. تجيب 4 تريدر وتعطيه $11 كيسموها فهمت. تجيب 4 $11 كيسموها فهمت.
نرجع.
طيب باكستاني فاروق 667 ايتم بالله. فاروق هذا كاركتر $9 ولات اوكي. ثم $3 للدونجون الحبة ماشي $3.
Text color, that's what color means here. The text color in the body should be red. So if I now change the color property from blue to red, you can see in the mini browser we have changed the text inside of our body to red. Because if we head over to the HTML, this text is indeed inside of our body. Now, as you might have noticed as well, the property is followed by colon and the value is followed by semicolon. And you have to have that notation, otherwise you'll break the example. So what I want you to do now is redesign this cookie widget. Make sure you change all of the listed CSS properties. That's background, color, font size, font weight, text align, and margin top. And what you'll change it to is up to you, but I've given you the hints of what kind of values the properties expect here in the comments on the right hand side. You can see comments in CSS is done with this star and slash character. So the grayed out text, as in with the HTML, is not interpreted by the browser. It's just help text for you in order to solve this challenge. And I'm intentionally not giving you any more information about what each of these properties mean, because I think they're pretty self-explanatory. So I want you to experiment with changing them and draw your own conclusions as to what, for example, the font size does to the styling on our page. And then once you've done this, once you've redesigned the cookie widget, move on to the next scrim and then I will show you how I would do it as well. Good luck. So, really good job writing your first lines of CSS. That is no small accomplishment. Now I'm going to show you how I would design my cookie widget. So I want my widget to have cookie colors. So for my background property, which is what sets the background color of the body, which fills up the entire browser at this point, I'm going to choose a color called saddle brown, like that. And you might wonder, well, how do I know that saddle brown is a color that CSS supports? Well, you might have noticed as you wrote CSS values that VS Code, our editor, starts suggesting values for you as you start typing. So that is how I found saddle brown. This suggestion box here isn't recorded by Scrimba itself, so you won't see it in recording, but you will see it as you interact with the code yourself. So we have the background. Now let's move on to the next property, which is color, and that dictates the color of the text. It is set to red, though let's choose white here. That looks pretty good. The next one, font size, dictates, well, the size of the font. And here you can see we are using px values, which is short for pixels, and you can choose whatever value you want. Let's see what happens if we increase it up to 200. Oh, wow. That is far too big. So instead, let's try something like 25. Yeah, that's pretty good. Next, there's the font weight. You can choose between lighter, normal, or bold. And if we change this to bold, you'll see there that our text suddenly got a bit thicker, which is exactly what this property does. It changes the thickness of the font. Okay, text align. It is set to right, but we can also set it to left or center. Let's see what happens if we do left, and that bumped the text over to the left-hand side. I think we should have our cookie widget with centered text like that. Finally, margin top, what does that do? Well, if we try to change this to, for example, 50, you can see that, oh wow, that created more space here at the top. So it adds margin, aka spacing, at the top. And here I think maybe 50 was a bit too much. Let's do 30. Yeah, that is just right. Now, you probably ended at a completely different styling than this. That is okay. The point here was to experiment. Before you leave, I'll give you a sneak peek at another tool you can experiment with, and that is a different way of describing colors in CSS called hex codes. So here, I'll paste in this weird looking code starting with a hashtag, and as you can see, it created the exact same color. So this here is actually a recipe for the saddle brown color, and it's actually a description of 3 different things: how much red, green, and blue this saddle brown color consists of. So if I change this 8 here to 1 instead, you can see that completely changes the color. Now, if that is confusing, don't worry, you'll learn more about that later. I just wanted to give you a sneak peek on it. As with all of these other properties, you are going to get more comfortable with all of this, so it's not a problem at all if you completely forget about all of these properties and values. Over time, as you do it again and again, it'll become a part of your muscle memory. So with that, let's carry on. Now that you know enough CSS to be dangerous, let's use your newly acquired superpower in order to destroy Wikipedia. And for that, we need a Wikipedia page, and about the coolest one there is this list of helicopter prison escapes. I mean, oh my god, how insane is that? So click this image and you'll be taken to this article, and then I'll show you step by step how we can destroy it with CSS. So the first thing you need to do is to right click, as that'll open this menu where you can choose inspect. And once you click that, the DevTools will open. Then choose the icon in the far left, as that allows you to use your cursor to select elements on the page, so that when you hover over an element like this one, you'll see that the DevTools selects it for you. So if you move your cursor over to the logo, you'll see that one selected, and if you move your cursor over to the main part of the screen here, you can see it selects the entire article. Once you're on that selection, I want you to click, because that'll select the specific. You move your cursor over to the logo, you'll see that one selected, and if you move your cursor over to the main part of the screen here, you can see it selects the entire article. Once you're on that selection, I want you to click, because that'll select the specific HTML element here in the Elements tab. And don't worry about all of this. You do not need to recognize the tags and attributes and everything you see here. What I instead want you to do is head over to the right hand side where you see element.style. Click there and you'll be able to actually apply CSS directly to this page. So you can, for example, write background red and boom. There we have really able to actually apply CSS directly to this page. So you can, for example, write background red and boom. There we have really ruined this article. Then if you select another element on the page from this body content element here, you can do the exact same thing. Click on the element style and now, for example, write font size and 30 pixels. And there you go. Now you can click on the X icon in the far right corner here, and then you can read about these helicopter prison escapes with a really bad background and huge text, if that's what you prefer. So feel free to spend an hour in this article, and then I will see you in the next scrim. Okay, so now it's time for you to yet again build the google.com homepage. But this time around, you're also going to write the CSS so that you'll understand everything that goes into building this elegantly designed search engine. As you can see, I've set up the basic skeleton here in the HTML file for you. In the body tag, we have an image, which is pointing to the google.png image, which lies in the same directory as our index.html folder up here. And we have an input type text, which is our search field. And we're only going to start with these two elements and then later move on to the buttons. Now, as you can see in the mini browser here, this looks horrible. It has no styling, so the logo is far too large, the input field doesn't look very good. So in short, there's a lot of work to do here. But before we can start writing CSS, you need to link to the CSS file. You can see I have a style CSS here, which just sets the background of the body to red as a way of testing whether it is actually a link to the HTML. Currently, it's not. You are going to have to link to the CSS file on your own. And if you remember a couple of scrims back, I showed you how to do that. Though, please don't look back. At that scrim in order to solve this challenge. Instead, Google it, because I do that almost every single time I have to link from an HTML file to a CSS file. So you should not be ashamed for Googling such a quote-unquote simple thing. Instead, just do that right now, because it's important practice, and then when you come back, I will show you how I would do it as well. let's have a look at how we can that went well. Now, let's have a look at how we can solve this. So I would simply type how to link to CSS into Google and click at the top result. This happens to be a W3 Schools article. Here you can see that there's a few different ways you can import. What we do, link well equals style sheet, href equals styles.css, and then closing it. And if we now refresh the browser, boom, there we go. It is red, looking horrible. So we can remove that so that it looks white again, but now we know that we have linked the CSS and the HTML together, so we are ready to move on and start. The first thing we want to fix in our example here are the widths of the elements, because if we compare it to the finished design, you can see that the input field is meant to be wider than the logo. However, in our example, that's not the case. Quite the opposite, actually. The logo is much wider than the input field. So we need to shrink the logo and then make the input field wider. So I'm going to start and do one of these, and then you will do the other. I happen to know that the width we want to have on this input field is 400 pixels. What I'm then going to do is target the input field using the element name and create a CSS selector, just writing input, then open and close curly bracket, and then simply write width and 400 px. And boom, there you can see, suddenly the input field widened quite a lot. And as you might have noticed, we're using this pixels value here again, which we've used a couple of times already actually. And if you're a little bit confused as to what a pixel is, you can think of it as the smallest unit of space that our screens can render. So a pixel is just a tiny square, so tiny that we actually need 400 of them stacked up besides each other in order to get a width of this size. So with that, I want you to fix the width of the Google logo. Select the image tag and set the width of the logo to 300 pixels. Go ahead and do that right now, and then I will show you how to do it as well when you return back to this scrim. Okay, let's do this. I'm gonna break this down into a few lines so I get some space above the input field, and then target the IMG element, the image element, open up the curly brackets, and do with 300 pixels, like that. Ooh! We're not quite yet at the finished design, but the ratio between the logo and the input field is now a lot better. Great job, let's move on. Okay, I've discovered a problem with our Google site, which is that if we make the browser really wide, you can see that suddenly the items stack up besides each other on the same line. And that's obviously not the kind of behavior we want. We want them to always be stacked on top of each other. And in order to fix this, you have to learn about inline elements versus block elements. And that's best understood through the lens of an example. So let's say that you, for example, have a collection of things you want to showcase. You could be like George Franzen, for example, and collect dinosaur poo. He actually has the world's largest collection of fossilized feces, and naturally he wants to exhibit them in a museum. And if he were to use display inline on his images, they would stack up besides each other, like this. So kind of like in a line, horizontally. However, had he used display block on his images, then they would stack up on top of each other. So a rule of thumb is display block stacks on top. Another way to look at this is that the block level element blocks out the rest of the available horizontal space so that nothing else can be placed there. And that is regardless of how wide this image is, the content itself. Display block requires control over all the horizontal space in its given container. So when this block image is placed here, and you add a new image, it would have to be placed underneath the previous one. And if it is display block as well, it'll block out the rest of the available horizontal space, and the next image have to be placed below that one again, and so on. So the solution is obviously to turn these elements into blocks. And I'm just going to give you the syntax here. This is how you write it, display : block. Go ahead and do that for both of these, and observe what happens to the example when you make the browser wide. Good luck. Okay, let's do this. So I'll do display block up here and the same here. If we look at the browser, seemingly nothing has happened. However, if we now make it wide, you can see, yes, no matter how wide the browser is, these will always stack up on top of each other. So, great job, let's move on. The next thing we need to fix is the lack of white space above our Google logo. Because if we take a look at the design here, we want quite a lot of space in between the top of the browser and the logo. And I'm not going to tell you how to add that, but if you can think back to the very first scrim in this section, we added some space above the text in our cookie widget. And that specific specific space is called margin, or margin top to be specific. So your job is to add some margin on top of our image. Right here you can start on line 7. So that our example here gets some breathing room, some white space above the logo and the input field. Go ahead and give this one a shot, and then I will of course show you the solution when you return back to me. Scrim in this section, we added some space above the text in our cookie widget. And that specific space is called margin, or margin top to be specific. So your job is to add some margin on top of our image. Right here you can start on line 7. So that our example here gets some breathing room, some white space above the logo and the input field. go ahead and give this one a shot, and then I will of course show you the solution when you return back to me. Okay, hopefully that went well. If not, no worries. I really pushed you out on thin ice here, so it's completely okay if you didn't remember that the property is called margin top, and what you add there is a pixel value. So for example, 100px, and there we go. We've now added a margin on the top of our image, and while we're still quite far off from our provided design here, we are getting closer. Great job, let's move on. Now, while it totally works to add the margin top directly on the image here, you'd most likely not see professional developers do this. Because what they do instead is wrap these two elements in some kind of container and then control the positioning of these elements indirectly via that container. And in order to do this, you have to learn about the div. I'm going to create an opening div and then indent these two, and then a closing div below here. Now, if we run this code, seemingly nothing has happened because the div actually does very little in itself, though it is indispensable for web developers. Just to show you how important it is, let's take a look at Facebook and my timeline. Here I've opened up DevTools and inspected one of the timeline items, and you can see it is actually a div inside of a div, inside of another div, inside of yet another div, inside of a div, inside of a div. Whew. Divs really do rule the world, so it's important that you learn about them. And the way we'll use this div now is by removing the margin top styling from the image and then add it to the div itself. And the reason this is important is, let's say that, for example, Google decides to create a video here instead, or a interactive doodle or some kind of game. They often play around with the Google logo. Well, if so, it's a really bad idea that it is the image itself that controls the margin from the top of the browser and down to the content, because that image might be removed. So it is a solution that'll get you into trouble in the future. So what we'll do here is we'll simply instead target the div and then remove the margin top from the image, and boom, it has popped up. Now we lost all of our white space, but if we add it back to our div, we are back at the design we started out with. Seemingly nothing has changed, but as you know, we have a better HTML structure, so we have definitely made good progress here. So with that, let's move on to the next scrim. The reason you need to learn about classes now is because our current setup, where we simply have the elements like this, and then selecting the elements using the element selector in CSS, will give us bugs down the line. Because when we add the two buttons beneath the input field, we'll actually wrap these two in a div as well. And let's see what happens at this point. What I'll do now is simply add the HTML for these buttons down here beneath the input field. So it is a div with two buttons inside of it. And then you can see we are closing that div, the inner div, and then we are closing the outer div. Let's run this code, and oh wow! What you can see is that the spacing between the input field and the buttons is totally off. And that is because our CSS element selector here selects any div it can find in the HTML document and applies the margin top to it. So it doesn't just select the first one, but it can select thousands of divs. So this is a very generic solution and likely not something we want to use, as we want to have multiple divs with different types of styling in our HTML element. So let's now instead fix this by doing the following. I'll write class equals Then, for example, main. This here is an attribute called class, so it's built into HTML. And this here is the name I'm giving my class. I want to call this div my main element. And now the way I select that in the CSS is by, instead of just writing the element name, simply doing dot main, like that. Now, if I rerun this code, you can see now the margin top is only applied to the outer div, our main class, and not to the div which wraps the two buttons. So that is exactly what we needed. Now, I'm going to remove these two buttons here because we don't want to deal with them just yet. And then I'm going to give you a challenge. First, you're going to add a class to each of these two elements. That is the image and the input. You have to decide what you will call the two classes, but make sure to give them different names. And then you're going to, in the CSS, replace the element selectors with class selectors. So that is the IMG selector here and the input selector here. These two in a div as well. And let's see what happens at this point. What I'll do now is simply add the HTML for these buttons down here beneath the input field. So it is a div with two buttons inside of it. And then you can see we are closing that div, the inner div, and then we are closing the outer div. Let's run this code, and oh wow! What you can see is that the spacing between the input field and the buttons is totally off. And that is because our CSS element selector here selects any div it can find.
سليح شليح
ملاح
ملاح
واش قايس واش كدير؟
كوكوش لا ضروري
خلينا نقراو خلينا
بعرف. ضروري قريت انا قبيل
اي ورلوك تي قالوا لي كاتشاب افيلابل
بس تقرا دوك
سيلكت اكسبيرينس.
انا ساعة ولا نقيسمك لا ساعة ولا
قليله شويه لا
يا
اسمعك تسمعوا فيها نورمال.
انت نورمال
نورمال باش نياو بعيد شوي الصون تاعك ماشي نورمال.
ساعة كي تفهم ابيض
واش اليوم نعم تشوف
المايك تاعهم واش يمشي لي.
ما
تقوليش لازم لي الاخر، ما تقوليش لازم لي
عندك سبليتر ولا ما عندكش؟
عندي بسبليتر وما مشاليش
بسبليتر وما مشاش كيف ما مشالكش بسبليتر؟
لازم لي الاخر كارت صون بالك.
هو اسمع هما يا اخي فيهم عندك زوج خرجات تاعهم
وحده
وعندك هذاك اللي يركب في الوحده يخرج الزوج ولا ما عندكش؟
يخرج الزوج
وراك مركب ونورمال في البي سي.
ما عنديكاهوليش
كي ركبتو ما عندكاش ركبتو من اللور ولا من قدام؟ وسير في يا اخي ما غلطش فيهم يا اخي تعرفهم يا اخي اللي في النص اسمع روح تراش بارامتر تاع الصون هاي وراي وين اوديو تراش نوض ادروات
راني بلاصي الاربودز راني بلاصي هذو الاربودز ونخدم بالكاسك قدام المايك.
معليش ادروات وين الصون دير وراك هي ادروات ودير
بركة البيت هربتها
راه ريكورد
طولت اخويا بزاف
روح لقدام رحت للسوق السوق بني شريفي قلت لك
السوق
ايه حمص وين شريف حرك اسمع كيف نروح لوسمك كيف نروح للسيتوز لوسمك
مازال ما كانش خدمه كي تجي خدمه
ودوم اليوم
نف
قالوا
نف باش يدزوني نروح نجيب
هذا
لكم
واحد.
باكس عندي.
يا يمشوا
واش الهادي
عم يمشوا وات ذا فاك
الجيم على بالي شفتها.
وات ذا فاك قبيل ما كانوش يمشوا
نقول لك ليه قبيل
إيه، اسمع وكيفها باهيين الفويس مليحه
حبه مليح إيه، مليح الفويس طراش بصح مليح
خمل
واحد
الكاش
الألدوم قيس.
خمل الكاش
اسمع كاين عارف
ألدوم
خير من
كاين
كاس.
البورتال تاع تويلايت
قول لي.
البورتال تاع ألدوم.
زبله خلينا نهضروا
اي ما صح حنا جيت لها انتم جيت تولز.
او يزيد في لافوا نقول ليش
داك اللي روح تراشل تاع ساوند في ريكورد ندير لها بارامتر نشوفوا عفسه
هنا كونفيدر
بروبريتي بروبريتي برك ماشي كون وروح الادفانسد هاك ندير اوديو انهانسمنتس وكل شيء خلاص هو مليح مالا هو مريكل مليح ما
ايه غير قبيل ما مشاليش ليك
هاو يمشي
ليك
راني نشوف ايش شتها تترم كي تتلم نحاول شادو بيرن هو كاين شادو بيرن واش قلت له في الوقت اسمع انا قالوا لي دير كاتشاب كويست هذه
معليش ما تحقش ديرها ما تحقش ديرها
in the HTML document and applies the margin top to it. So it doesn't just select the first one, but it can select thousands of divs. So this is a very generic solution and likely not something we want to use, as we want to have multiple divs with different types of styling in our HTML element. So let's now instead fix this by doing the following. I'll write class,
لا انا هابط لك رفه
then for example main. This here is an attribute called class, so it's built into HTML, and this here is the name I'm giving my class. I want to call this div my main element. And now the way I select that in the CSS is by, instead of just writing the element name, simply doing dot main, like that. Now if I rerun this code, you can see simply doing in my class. I want to call this div my main element. And now the way I select that in the CSS is by, instead of just writing the element name, simply doing dot main, like that. Now if I rerun this code, you can see now the margin top is only applied to the outer div, our main class, and not to the div which wraps the two buttons. So that is exactly what we needed. Now I'm going to remove these two buttons here because we don't want to deal with them just yet. And then I'm going to give you a challenge. First, you're going to add a class to each of these two elements, that is the image and the input. You have to decide what you will call the two classes, but make sure to give them different names. And then you're going to, in the CSS, replace the element selectors with class selectors. So that is the IMG selector here and the input selector here. And obviously, the CSS class selectors, you're going to replace them with as the ones you have added to the elements right here. So go ahead and do this right now.
مرة يستلم زبي هذي
واش جيت
ها
موفيتوني ولا ايش صرا
ايه مو بينار بينك وحدك فوق تبان مدبر اساسا
يعني نقرا
انت صيد قلت لك تقرا بالرياكت بديت ولا مزال؟
لا مع السي اس اس يعني شغل
تهلا في اي حاجه قول لي
صوت واحد السيت باهي
Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's now do it together. So for the image tag, I'm simply going to do class equals,
لا لا صوت خير
then I'll call this logo dash
المهم تحصل
IMG.
باهي باهي
So
بزاف
here I'm
شغل
using a
يدخل
convention
به.
where I'm first giving my
Yeah,
class
class,
a
I can
descriptive
give it
name
class
and then using a
طبعا
dash
كاين
and then
كاين
specify
كاين شي لي كلور هذا السيت اسمه سكريمبا. كاين شي لي كورس تخلص فيهم صح، كاين لي باطل وتاع باطل باهيين شغل لي شغل شوف راك تشوف ولاك تلعب.
نشوف وقدمها على لاغو شويه نزوميها بزاف ولا انا نزوميتها
شوف زعما شغل راك تلعب راك تتفرج وبغى يعطيك تشالنج فاهم، يقول لك دير تشالنج. هنا كيما هنا تشالنج تروح تكتب ما فيهاش الهضره تقدر تكتب راك تشوف شغل تكتب في الاخر من يكتب هو كيما هنا قال لك دير قال لك هذو دير لهم كلاس ايماج كلاس راك فاهم، دير لها اسم كيما سميتها ايماج وهذه ندير لها كلاس
نفهمك شويه في الكلاس هذا وشني
نسموها ان. ومن بعد تروح لسي اس اس. اصبر تروح ستايلز تروح لسي اس اس شيت تاع سي اس اس كلاس هذوك شغل غير اجي سي اس اس فات سيليكسيون.
تحكم كل سي اس اس جافا سكريبت.
لا بصح شغل فات سيليكسيونيهم في حق سيليكسيون موفر راك فاهم، باسكو زعما نقولو انت دوكا تبغي تسيليكسيوني ديف راك فاهم. اسمعني قول لي راني غلط ولا مانيش غلط. تبغي تسيليكسيوني ديف كون تروح السي اس اس ستايل تاعك تروح في الشيت تاع سي اس اس تكتب ديف يتسيليكسيونيو كاع لي ديف راك فاهم.
راني فاهم
بصح كون دير ديف كلاس وتسميها وتروح في السي اس دير نقطه واسم الكلاس تاعك يتسيليكسيوني غير هذيك راك فاهم.
and then specifying the element as well. This is an IMG element, but it could have been, for example, an SVG or something else.
تكودي بالكلاس نيم فهمت.
Now I don't expect you to have followed the same.
ما تكتب فيه عفسه. فور اكزامبل نحب نجيب الانبوت مثلا نروح نجيب الالم هذاك باسم الكلاس تاعو، عيط له باسم الكلاس تاعو باش نجيب منه الفاليو هذيك فهمت.
Convention, there are plenty of CSS conventions and it doesn't matter at all what you used in your example. You can call your classes whatever you want. Okay, for the input we'll do class equals search dash input like that. Okay, let's move to the CSS. Then I'll replace this with hot. Okay, now it's time to take a closer look at margins. And you've already dipped your toes into this as you have used margin top, so you might have some intuition about what margins do. However, now you're going to learn it properly through creating flags with CSS, because flags are just awesome. I mean, take a look at this flag here, for example, from the Republic of Venice, a state which existed for over 1,000 years in Europe, and it contains, of course, a flying lion holding a book. I mean, what's more natural than that? Or this one right here, for the Isle of Man. I mean, have you ever seen a more creepy creature than this three-legged thing right here? Imagine having that thing running after you. That would not be fun, and this flag would be really hard to create in CSS actually, so we're not going to create this one. We're going to start off at a much easier level with just some very simple shapes. So let's have a look at those actually. Here is what we're going to work with. As you can see, there's simply 3 divs inside of the body tag, and each div has a class red, blue, or green. If we check out the styles.css, you can see that these 3 classes apply a background color to each of the elements and sets the height to 100 pixels. And here we have the result, 3 rectangular boxes that are stacked on top of each other. And that tells us that these are display block, because display block stacks on top. There's one thing that bothers me here, and that is that we have a little bit of white space around the 3 items. Why is that? Well, actually, it's because our browser is trying to help us here. It's assuming that we want a little bit of space around the body tag, so that these 3 don't touch the edges of the browser. So what's actually going on here in code is that the browser targets the body and sets a margin of 8 pixels. If you notice, when I added this, nothing changed. So if I remove this, it's still the same, meaning that this style here is applied automatically. So that means that margin is actually the space around an element. Because now if we change this to 0, boom, there you can see, suddenly our divs touch the edges of the browser. Now, here at the bottom, they stop after 300 pixels since we've told them to. So this margin 0 here seemingly didn't change anything at the bottom, because the bottom contains white space anyway if we make our browser tall enough. But anyway, that's a digression. Let's get it back so that the browser is completely filled up with these 3 items. And now let's play a little bit around with margins. So what do you think will happen if I add a margin top of 10 pixels on the red here? Take a guess. Okay, margin top, 10 pixels. Boom! It added 10 pixels on the top. What do you think will happen if I add margin left 10 pixels as well? Let's try it. Okay, so it added 10 pixels on the left hand side. It's only on the red rectangle, not the blue or green rectangle. Likewise, if I do margin right 10 pixels, it adds 10 pixels to the right hand side as well. If I do 100, it eats up almost a third of our red rectangle. Okay, so now it's your turn. I want you to add 100 pixels of margin on the bottom of the red box. So go ahead and give that a shot right now. Okay, if you did margin bottom 100 px like that, I want to congratulate you because you just created the flag of Monaco. Really good job creating your first CSS flag. And now let's do that yet again. Here is your challenge. You are going to create the flag of the Gambia. And here we have that flag. However, there's a catch. You can only do this by applying styles to the blue box. So by adding margin to this CSS rule right here. So go ahead and give that a shot right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. The way to do it is by doing margin top. Let's try 10 pixels and see. Actually, I think we want our white space to be a little bit more than 10 pixels. So let's do 20 like that. And then margin bottom as well, 20 pixels. And there, I think we have a pretty good flag for the Gambia. Now, before we move on to our Google project, there's one little weird thing I want to tell you about margin top and bottom. Because what do you think happens if I add, for example, margin bottom of 15 to this red element here? Well, according to my logic, the margin right here would be 35 pixels. Because we added 20 pixels on top of the blue, and if we add 15 at the bottom of the red one, that should be 35 pixels in total. However, now that I added this, nothing happened. And that is because margin top and margin bottom will, in many situations, collapse into each other. So that as long as this margin is smaller than this will take precedence. And it's only when this one becomes larger, for example 25, that it will kick in. So let's take it back to 15. And to make things even worse, there's actually scenarios where this doesn't happen. However, digging into that is outside of the scope of this lecture. I just want you to be aware of it, because if you're suddenly in a situation where your margins don't seem to add up, it is probably... Okay, we're back at our Google project. I want to give you a quick challenge. I want you to add some space between the logo and the search field, because as you can see here, there's some spacing in between the elements in our design. However, in our project now, they are crammed together. There are 2 ways you can do this using margins. And I want you to think about which 2 ways that is, and choose one of them. Go ahead and do this right now. Okay, hopefully that went well. Let's do it. So you can either add a margin bottom to the logo, or you can add a margin top to the search field. I'm going to go with adding margin bottom to the logo, as I think either way is as good as the other at this stage. Margin bottom, and how much do we want to add? Well, let's try 20px. And yeah, as you can see, we've got some spacing. The bottom of the G is not touching the top of the input field. And if we compare that to the example, I think it looks more or less the same. So, great job, let's move on. Okay, now you are going to learn about centering elements in CSS. And that is a scary topic for a lot of developers. So scary that this Stack Overflow question about how to horizontally center an element has been viewed 4.5 million times. So if you think this is a little bit confusing, you are in very good company. So don't worry about it. So with that in mind, let's move over to our example. You are going to center this dinosaur poo. As you can see in the CSS, it has just one property set at this point, which is a width of 200 pixels. That is because the image is so wide originally that if I don't set that width, it'll just take up more space than we have available. And setting the width of it is actually an important thing in order to center it, because there are 3 things that need to be in place when we are to center elements with the technique you are about to learn, aka centering with margins. And these 3 components are: first, the element needs to be display block, because how is an element supposed to center itself if it doesn't command full control over all the horizontal space? If it's display inline and allows other elements to stack themselves besides the element, well, then it won't be able to center itself because that space now is busy with other things. So in order to center this poo, it needs to control all the horizontal space. So it needs this block like that. Now that didn't change anything, but under the hood, the poo now controls the full horizontal space. Okay, the second part is that it must have a width, and that is what we've done here already, because how is this item supposed to be centered inside the browser if it is wider than the browser itself? That's often what happens with either large elements or with some HTML elements who just naturally actually expand to take up all the available space in the block. So we have to make sure that our element has a width. And finally, we set the margin on the left-hand side and the right-hand side to the value auto. Let's just do that. Margin left, auto. Oh wow. Now it pushed the poo all the way to the right-hand side. Because auto here means take up all the available space. And since this is a block element, the available space is all the space that's left after the poo has taken up its 200 pixels. So it just ate up all of this space and turned it into margin. However, at this point, margin right enters the party. Margin right, and says, I want the available space as well. And at that point, the margin left and margin right goes into a discussion and decides, well, actually, since there are 2 of us here, pushing on each of the side of the element, trying to get all of the available white space, let's just divide it evenly amongst both of us. And the result? Well, it is that the item is centered. So that was a long explanation of centering with margins. If you feel confused, don't worry about it right now. All you need to do is remember these 3 conditions and just be aware of the 4.5 million other developers who are in or have been in the same boat as you. Let's move on to...
Hey, it is...